I'd like now to introduce Joan Bennett, Distinguished Professor in the Department of Plant Biology at Rutgers, State University of New Jersey, New Brunswick.
People have been going for quite a while, so I won't be upset if you decide to take a little bio break while I'm speaking. It's a pleasure to be here. I've heard of Marianne Liebert for years. It's the first time I've gotten to meet her in person, and I understand why her good reputation precedes her. And of course, for those of us who are scientists, women in science, especially those of us who are trained in genetics, Rosalind Franklin remains a major hero. Okay, nope, I need to go off. What do I do to advance the slides? I have now succeeded in turning them off. I pushed something and they went off instead of forward.
Don't push the bottom button.
Well, that's what I did. Okay, so push the side button, huh? Also, I'd like to do a dedication on this lecture. I'm here because I'm currently chairing the committee that produced this report on sexual harassment. And when I first learned anything about the formal science of sexual harassment, I don't think I appreciated how much had been done before by scholars. And I don't think understood just how important Anita Hill was at that moment in history and the amazing courage she displayed. I took this, or somebody took this picture on her cell phone at a meeting that the National Academies held last year in Irvine, and I was struck by her modesty and her fact that she's just a very, very nice person who nevertheless was able to stand up to cross-examination that sends most of us quivering. So a little bit of background. The National Academies, and that's science, engineering, and medicine, has a committee on women. It was founded in 1990, and the committee tackles important topics. We may take on patenting in the near future. Until recently, Rita Colwell was chair of this committee, and Rita is an amazing woman who's very, very effective, and among her talents is she's good at talking people into doing things by some combination of persistence and wiles. And so she twisted my arm along with Vivian Pinn to put together a workshop in 2016 on the topic of sexual harassment. If none of you have had the pleasure of meeting Vivian, she's a remarkable woman. In 1991, she became the first full-time director at NIH of an Office of Women and Health. She was the first African-American woman to go to the University of Virginia Medical School. Recently, they renamed a building that had been named after a slaveholder after her, and Vivian's fond of pointing out that she's neither dead nor rich and has been a big donor, so it's a pretty big honor. But Vivian and I took on this topic, and although we both know a fair amount about our fields, we knew nothing about the scholarship or the law or most of the complicated issues around sexual harassment. And so, we started trying to figure out, well, what is it we're dealing with? And one of the definitions that's largely held up is this one from the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, which speaks to the fact that, hey, this is something you're not supposed to do. But when you look at what's their definition and up on the website, you'll see that it talks about the sexy part of sexual harassment, sexual favors, physical stuff. And then it also has this big blanket portion that, well, that's not all it is. It's a whole bunch of other things. So once you get into the rabbit's nest of definitions, you find like the word sex. This word covers a lot of territory, and there's the neutral territory. When you fill out a form, male or female, and now they give you other choices too, and and then there's all the stuff that goes along with this being male and female, and it really can be problematic, just starting with the definitions. Vivian and I used to talk to each other on the phone regularly in the morning as we were trying to dig our way through this. And so, I don't know, to simplify it, if you just go into your word program and put the word sex in and see what it says under synonyms, it says gender. And then if you put sexual in, up come these words like sensual, erotic, carnal. And I'm leaning on this because I want to say when we use the term sexual harassment, it is pushing all kinds of buttons, and people will have all kinds of different reactions to the term. And most people haven't done what Vivian and I and a few other people have done, which is to go through and try to figure out how it's being used legally and how it's being used in the news press, et cetera. Word gender, male or female, and right now that's also open to a lot of issues with the trans things. But the notion that gender with one's simpler maybe, where I was taught that sex is about the biology of it. Gender's the things we do to display our biology, like we women tend to wear our hair longer in this day and age, and jewelry, and maybe we put fingernails on our polish and wear skirts and blah, blah, blah. The way in which men display their maleness, it's not only dress, but it's behavior, and also in the fact that males legally for a very long time have had a much greater range of ways that they could live their lives and function as individuals. Popular culture often gives us insights on things, and here's a dated cartoon, but we women have been excluded from professional and other aspects of life for a long time, and as we try to push our way in, we find that there's something very entrenched in our popular culture and in our other forms of culture that make it harder for us to be thought of as the same as men, as people. And then this word sex. When you put the word sex out there, people immediately start thinking about the carnal and the voluptuous. And to this day, I am surprised at how many men don't seem able to see women as just people. And I had a rather upsetting experience this summer. I'm not a young woman. I was at a reunion with some old college friends. A couple of them have husbands in their 80s. And the way it happens at parties, there were 6 couples. The men had sort of gone off in one direction, and the women were in the kitchen. There were too many women in the kitchen, so I went and joined the men. And as I was walking into this group of aging men, and just saying, hey, you need a female, contact here. One of the men looked at me. He says, "Oh, we're too old for that, Joan." I mean, I'm here to talk to you. I mean, what is it that you don't interact with women unless we're sex objects, or that it's flirting? And there's so much of that in male culture, and I continue to be surprised. So, okay, Vivian and I had this workshop. We learned a lot about the scholarship. We learned a lot about the connotations of the words. We learned there are a lot of experts out there in the legal field, in the human resources field, and in the scholarship field. And so the National Academy Committee decided that we would try to have a consensus study. And this is where Rita, with her wiles and her contacts and her persistence and her amazing energy level, went out and raised the money that has resulted in this report. So that's my background. I don't have to tell you, and the report came out last June, the National Academy reports take you a while, that before the report came out, after Vivian and I had run our workshop in 2016, along came the Me Too movement. And so the report couldn't hardly be appearing at a better time for women in science, because our popular culture had prepared the way. And if you're a woman, You know that sexual harassment's not something that's just limited to the entertainment industry. It pervades women's lives entirely, no matter what your profession, even if you do everything right, you're a traditional homemaker. There are a lot of statistics on undergraduates. Undergraduates are a good population for sociologists to study, and we can't entirely know how much goes on, but whatever study you look at shows there's a lot of sexual harassment out there. And it is a very, very common phenomenon. Young women are particularly vulnerable. Hey, it goes into the church, and we're hearing more and more about sexual harassment, sexual abuse. Traditionally, when we've looked at the terms, we've thought about, men hitting on women, men assaulting women. There's also a lot of men assaulting other men and young boys. And I put the word silence out there because so often when matters are sexual, people are ashamed, they're afraid, they don't report. When it happens to very young people or children, the whole world of adult authority comes into place. And then there are a lot of more subtle things that go on. Even those of us who are grown up and have been out there in the professional world for a long time, I think have behavior patterns that lead to this whole, quote, conspiracy of silence. Well, you had an example yesterday, if you were here for Joanne's wonderful lecture, and it's one of the hang-ups that all of us women have had about group things, but she gave this example about somebody asking her how much a certain diversity program is going to cost, and she says about $500,000. So then a man comes in and says, actually, I think it'll be about $500,000. And as she said, nobody said anything. And I found this cartoon, and every woman I know has had this over and over again. That's an excellent suggestion, Ms. Triggs. Perhaps one of the men here would like to make it. We all regularly say something, nobody pays attention, man says it, and then it's the good idea. So I found this online, which is my way of trying to talk to you about some of this silent stuff, and it's some tongue-in-cheek lessons on how women should behave to be perceived as not threatening. Like if you say, I have an idea, no, you should think, I'm just thinking out loud here. How many times have you heard a woman say that? Somebody steals your idea. Yes, that's exactly what I said. Did Joanne say that? No. She waited for someone else to say it. Thank you for articulating that so clearly. Apparently that's what society wants Joanne to say when the man repeats her suggestion. Then what we're here to talk about today, the sexist comments. If you confront a guy, you get labeled as a difficult woman. I think every woman sitting in this room probably has been labeled as difficult more than once. We wouldn't be here otherwise. And many of us do that, or we smile, or we change the subject. We're not very good at confronting men. Threatening. I'm the one that taught you that 6 months ago. I'd love to hear you explain it to me again. I mean, these are funny little things, but I'm trying to put the silence is not just keeping quiet about sexual harassment. It's about the way we women have been socialized to behave. And almost everyone can recognize these kinds of behaviors and how they go on. And in the political sphere, we've heard a lot about how women have a narrower band of how they can behave and talk. And this speaks to it. We really have trouble being perceived nicely by the press and by others if we are authoritative and fight back. And then if we don't, we're not perceived as strong enough. And it's a very, very difficult balance to portray. And we've just had a recent example of the high, high price that women pay when they stand up and speak out, especially on topics of sexual harassment. I'm not sure whether she's been able to move back into her house yet. I haven't heard, maybe so, but yeah, okay. Now to the report. If you haven't gotten it, just go to the National Academy's website. You can download it for free, or you can send in some money and get yourself this nice handy copy, which I have been using as a regular reference. It was released in June, and it's a fine report. It was chaired by Sheila Woodnow of MIT and Paula Hammonds, president of Wellesley College, and both remarkable women, backed up with a fine committee. As I said, it took several years. They, as all NAS studies uncover, showed that we don't know as much as we want to, as we should. A lot more research needs to be done, but we already know a lot. I don't want to belabor the statistics on frequency, but yes, women in the scientific fields writ large experience a great deal of harassment. Because of the nature of scientific fields, we have some special problems, observatories, field stations, even some of the odd hours late at night in laboratories lead to the fact that women are vulnerable. And I'm mostly going to be focusing on women. I realize that males sometimes also have effects, but the data show overwhelmingly that women are the targets of most of the harassment. It varies. Some institutions seem to have higher levels, and some professions is higher levels. So women in the health sciences, nurses and physicians report particularly high levels. Women of color, women who are not straight heterosexual in some of their behaviors experience even more than white straight women. The National Academy came up with this beautiful image, which is showing an iceberg, and it lists perhaps too much information, but the reason that it's a useful image is that the public consciousness is up atop the tip of the iceberg, and yet the bulk of the problem is this stuff that we don't see underneath the iceberg. So the top of the iceberg is the sex, the carnal, the assault, the ways in which people think of sex as sexual, and some of the bad things that go on around that particular area. So there are legal terms, sexual assault, when people forcibly are touching women in inappropriate ways. Rape, you can go to jail for rape if you're convicted. Stalking, these are criminal things. Some of the stuff is a little bit harder and more slippery, slopish. The inappropriate touching, and a true story from my own life. I remember how proud I was when I was hired into a tenure-track position at Tulane University because they'd never had a woman in that position. It's a long time ago. I'm an old woman. It was 1971. And they had a reception, a very fancy New Orleans reception at the Alumni House for new faculty. And while I was at that reception, the then provost came up and he touched me, only much more intimately than that, more than once. And I found myself spending the rest of this reception standing up against a wall with my husband, who was with me, and the provost. Okay, I'm young, but I don't deserve to be patted in that inappropriate way by a man of authority. And I still remember it. There's a lot of this stuff that goes on. I think many of us have had great big tall men come and loom over us at desks or at other, and you have to believe that there is an understanding that that kind of physical looming is not something that makes you feel comfortable. And then there's the little stuff. There's this great new slang term, manspreading. But I don't think guys know they do this to us. It's so common for a man to just spread out and take a lot of place. And on average, men are bigger anyway, but they sort of psychologically and use this bigness to make us feel like like we don't necessarily deserve as much space as they do. Okay, I'm not going to focus on this physical stuff because, as I say, even though that's what most people think about, this report shows very strongly that it's the other stuff which the report carefully then tries to call gender harassment instead of sexual harassment to get away from the sexual connotations. I don't know if it exactly succeeds, but having to do with all the other stuff that goes on between men and women that makes things difficult for women. And the bottom line of the report is when there's a lot of gender harassment, it's going to create an environment that's much more likely to lead to the sexual. That if you have a lot of this little, quote, it's not so little stuff, this other stuff going on in environments that are male-dominated, environments where nobody pays attention to it, that's when the likelihood that the assault is going to happen goes way up. And so there are whole cultures, there are whole countries where women really live in danger because there's so much that happens. And, you know, the verbal abuse, the name calling. You know, sometimes it's very insulting, bitch, slut, words like that. Sometimes it's more subtle. Girls can't do this, or dumb blonde. I know about that one a good bit. There can be things written in the restroom walls. There can be online threats. And even if it has nothing to do with the sexual nature, it can be very, very upsetting. And I like cartoons because they often make us see things that we wouldn't otherwise see, and people who draw these cartoons are really very brilliant at pushing. The way in which men like to take over, take credit. Paula Hammonds likes to put it this way, the difference between a come on and a put down. And much of what happens to women that gets under this huge term, sexual harassment, is the put down. It's the demeaning remark, it's the insult, it's the taking out of temper. And here's an art thing that it can have huge, huge psychological damage on women and undermine confidence and make women withdraw from workplaces. Women who experience a great deal of the gender harassment are much less likely to stick with things. They have lower job productivity, and they're less happy. And it can ruin academic careers. Students don't like being in places where they feel uncomfortable. And we know that many, many more women drop out in the science pipeline. I don't like that word, pipeline, than do men at every step of the way. And the report documents that actually some women who've had rather profound harassment actually suffer from PTSD. I showed that slide before. So data, not just women leave science fields, a lot of men leave science fields, and given how much it costs to educate a scientist or a physician or an engineer, it's a shame, but women leave at higher rates, and white women and people of color. The National Academy doesn't like to just document what's wrong. We like to recommend some of the things that should be done. And here's the infographic that was created. It's so much information on that infographic that I've made a couple of sub-slides to break it down. And the first recommendation is built into what all of us have been trying to do for decades and decades and decades, and that's to try to make sure that there are more women in the system at every level. And it's not easy, but it's happening and it's getting better. That I know the reason I was so happy to be at that faculty party back in 1971 is I'd had 5 biologist women in New Orleans tell me I'd never get hired by Tulane because they didn't hire women. And I was so proud when they hired me because I was a woman. That for a long time, you know, we really couldn't even get our foot in the door. Unfortunately, some of the stuff that's gone on in academic institutions around Title IX is very focused, though, on the legal liability. So Title IX offices collect all these data about the number of women on the search committee and the number of women who were interviewed and everything, so that if they're sued or investigated, they can show they did it right. But it doesn't necessarily have much emphasis on, are you really making a difference? And unfortunately, Title IX has driven too much, I think, of this emphasis on legal liability. And the world has not, it's changed, but hasn't changed as much as we want. And study after study after study shows that even women in the same kinds of jobs are still paid less, and we can't entirely figure out why. This recommendation may seem counterintuitive, but it's the idea that we can't necessarily change how people feel, think, but we can do a better job of changing how they behave. And a lot of diplomacy and good manners and civility goes around this idea, and that we may never change the opinion of some people that women just don't belong in these jobs. But we can nevertheless have systems in which women are hired more frequently. And an example, I think, is that like smoking. Maybe smokers have succeeded in convincing themselves and in believing that they're not hurting their health, but a lot of smokers like to believe that it doesn't hurt them to smoke in a bar or something like that. But we've changed a lot of behavior by making it something that you don't do. And you can do that around women's issues too. You can make it something that people are not allowed to do, and things get better. You can make it wrong in an institution to hang pornographic calendars in public spaces, and it changes things. I'm not good at HR policy, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but all institutions need to be clear about what they're trying to do, transparent about their reports, and regularly try to figure out how people are feeling. And climate issues are not easy to assess, but again, so often somebody at the top will do some climate study and it misses the people who are actually needing to be heard from. And this is a controversial recommendation of the report. Many of you may remember in the early 90s when research misconduct was a big ticket item at NSF and whatever. For a while, NSF was defining sexual harassment as an example of research misconduct. They dropped it out and said, no, we're going to focus on data fabrication and that sort of thing, plagiarism. But we need to at least make research integrity recognize that doing bad things to young women in the lab is perhaps just as worthy of losing your NSF grant as, or your NIH grant or your foundation grant as fabricating data. And some of the, like NSF and NIH are tackling this, some other funding agencies, not so much. Good manners. I think our culture has suffered from a great loss of civility, and the frequency with which you hear swear words in the media and the ease with which people insult each other and scream at each other. We'd all be better off if there were more good manners. And then both men and women are very uncomfortable with intervening. In fraternities, if a couple of guys see somebody hitting on a woman or getting her drunk or hitting on a woman who is unconscious, if a couple guys come in and stop that, it would go a long way. And regularly, people look the other way. Many of us are very embarrassed when we see something like this going on and we don't have the courage to stand up. I love this cartoon. It says, "No, we're good. This gentleman accidentally touched my breast and I accidentally broke his nose." I mean, having just said something about civility, this is perhaps not the right slide to show, but I think a lot of us have these fantasies that, oh, I should have done such and such. I really wanted to get back at him. And so I think that's why and so I've been told to move on. Okay, we need better HR. I've been going on too long. We also need to do something about the traditional way in which scientists mentor one another. The student-mentor relationship provides many opportunities for men to misbehave. A colleague of mine in the political science department talked about a recent graduate student who went in for counseling and about her career and whatever, and the next thing she knew, her mentor was rubbing her thighs. And yeah, it's not good. It drives women away, and we need to have better systems to make students, graduate students, postdocs, not so financially and scholarly dependent on their mentors. Okay. Women are paying a harassment tax. It affects our health. It affects how well we persist in a field. And I want to say that I'm glad the silence has been broken. There are lots of places now we can share our stories. Men are rethinking. It's too bad we don't have more cameras for the moments of the harassment, because they're usually very private moments, and it turns into he said, she said, and he usually goes deny, 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 no matter what happened. I want to end on an optimistic note. I love the aphorism that goes about it. Is the glass half empty or is it half full? The aphorism is, it depends on whether you're drinking or pouring. I'm a big believer in the pouring part. I got my PhD 51 years ago in 1967, over half a century. And so I went looking for a picture of what things were like in 1967 when I entered my professional world. And I found this one. This is the Boston Marathon. A woman broke in and tried to run in it. And the people were pushing her and tearing at her clothes because she is not allowed to run in the marathon. She's female. I mean, it looks absurd now. You know, women run in the marathons all the time. In fact, we can beat men at 50 miles, maybe not at 26, but we're pretty good runners. I mean, in my lifetime, this has changed, and it gives me optimism that we can change a lot of other things. I'm a feminist. I'm a human being. I'm not just somebody that a man has to see as a woman. Next Friday, the National Academy is going to be holding a meeting. You might want to come if you aren't already signed up in Washington at the NAS headquarters. One of my favorite aphorisms, Neil deGrasse Tyson. We're lucky to be scientists. We're really lucky. It's a fabulous profession to be in, and with an artistic representation of what has been called the most beautiful X-ray crystallography image ever taken, Rosalind Franklin's double helix. Thank you for listening.